Hello everyone, and welcome to what is now the 5th annual Holocaust Memorial Day event at the Institute of Continuing Education, which is where we are this evening. And I am really pleased to introduce Maurice Blik as our speaker this evening. And Maurice has very kindly agreed to come and be interviewed about his life's work. Now, we're going to be talking about Maurice's book, The Art of Survival, which he wrote with his wife, Deborah. And I'm going to be talking to Maurice about his life and career. And one thing that's very important to Maurice, identify as a Holocaust survivor. Although he is one, Maurice is a sculptor. And we're going to be talking about how Maurice's experiences as a child have really come out in his sculpture, but we're going to be talking above and too, I hope. So Maurice was born in Amsterdam in 1939, and he was deported to Bergen-Belsen when he was just 4 years old, but he has some very clear memories of his time in the camp, and we're going to be talking about those this evening. But Maurice has had a long career in art, and it started at the beginning of the 1960s when he became an art teacher in secondary schools and then a lecturer in further education colleges. And in 1969, Maurice got a postgraduate art teacher certificate from the London University Institute of Education. And then from 1969 to 1980, Maurice was a lecturer in art education at Hornsey College of Art and Design. From 1980 to 1991, Maurice was a lecturer in visual art at Middlesex Polytechnic, now a university, of course. And really only in the 1980s, when Maurice was in his 40s, did he really come into in terms of his artwork and his sculpture. In 1991, Maurice gave up teaching to work full-time on his sculpture, and Maurice has received many accolades. In 1996, he was elected president of the Royal Society of British Sculptors. In 1997, he was elected fellow of the Royal Society of Arts. And his CV is full of exhibitions and art fairs and commissions and books and films telling his story. So I'm very honoured that Maurice has agreed to be interviewed by me today. Maurice doesn't know entirely all of the questions that I'm going to ask, so I'll try not to take you too much by surprise, Maurice. It's really only in recent years that Maurice has agreed to talk about the earlier part of his life. In 2015, Natasha Kaplinsky interviewed Maurice for the UK's Holocaust Memorial Commission, which she was interviewing survivors for the National Archives. And you might remember last year seeing on the BBC the documentary, The Last Survivors. Now, I don't know if that had been repeated from an earlier year, but I saw it for the first time last year. And I saw Maurice speaking on that documentary, and it was then that I decided that I wanted Maurice to come and tell his story to all of you this year. Maurice's book, The Art of Survival, came out just last year, but I want to just start off, before I let Maurice get a word in edgeways, I want to start off by telling you how I first encountered Maurice's work. And as some people watching might know, a lot of my research in the past has been carried out in the Channel Islands and in Jersey at a site called the Hoog B, which is a Neolithic chamber tomb. During the German occupation of the island, the Germans built a bunker on the side of that chamber tomb. And today that site is a memorial to the slave workers who came to Jersey, came to the Channel Islands to build bunkers. And at that memorial is one of Maurice's sculptures. And the sculpture is of a man emerging from the ground, but with his head on backwards, to illustrate the dislocation he felt as a slave worker being brought to Jersey to work underground. So that piece of sculpture was by Maurice, and that was the first time that I encountered his work. So maybe we'll touch on that later, Maurice. But one thing I do emphasize is that the title of today's talk, L'Chaim, is it's a toast to life. And Maurice wants to focus on life, not death today, but because it's Holocaust Memorial Day week, I hope you don't mind if we focus on that part of your life.
Absolutely, yeah.
So
Thank you.
Welcome to Madingley Hall. Welcome to the Institute of Continuing Education.
A lovely introduction. Thank you.
Well, and I'm very pleased that you agreed to come and talk to me today.
Yeah.
And you know, I feel like I've been waiting many years really to speak to you after seeing your sculpture in Jersey. You probably saw it about 17 years ago, I should think.
That's about right. Yes,
Yeah.
yes, a while back, indeed.
Yes. So I'm going to ask you questions chronologically from your past, Maurice. And you were born, as I said, in 1939 in Amsterdam. That's to right. A Dutch father and an English mother.
Yeah.
And for those of you who saw the documentary or look at Maurice's book, you'll see that Maurice looks very much like his father. And we'll talk about your father later. So your father was Barend. Do you pronounce it Barend? Barend. And your mother Marie. What do you remember about the very earliest days of the German occupation? I know you were very young, but do you have memories at that time?
I do have a few. I mean, as you say, I was a little 4-year-old. I remember, I suppose, about the occupation where we lived on a first floor flat, and my sister Clara and myself, she's a couple of years older than me, we used to be able to sit at the window and look down into the street and see from time to time German troops going up the street. And certainly on one occasion, I remember civilian, people who lived there were being taken up the street with the troops. And I remember they had big open green cars, open topped, and I remember the officers, the big guys sitting in the back in their long leather coats, and they'd have outriders on motorbikes. So it's quite a impressive sight in a way. And as far as I remember, on one occasion they were taking people up the road, and the woman or children, I don't know, anyhow, one of her family was being taken away. She wasn't, and she was running after them, and they just shot her, and that was that. That's a very vivid memory. Obviously, I'm 4 years old. I didn't really understand what was going on, but that was it. And we lived in this first floor flat, as I say, and on one occasion, on the ground floor, there was a grocery shop, a grocer's shop. And from time to time, my mother or my father would say, go down and get a loaf of bread or whatever it was. And on the one occasion, I went down, and there was a German soldier there, and he said in German, which is close enough to Dutch, where do you live? And I very innocently sort of pointed upstairs. And the next thing is I'm going upstairs, and he's clumping along behind me, these wooden, very steep stairs in Amsterdam. Anyway, he's clumping along with his rifle on his shoulder, and then went into our house flat. My father wasn't there, my mother was there, and they exchanged some words or whatever, I don't know, and then gone. So I've always, after that, I remember that very clearly, and I always felt guilty that I'd let this guy into our house. But when you're 4 years old and you don't argue with some guy who's 2 meters tall with a gun on his back. I don't know quite how things developed, but shortly after that, we were removed from our house and taken off to Camp Westerbork, which was a camp in Holland, which was a sort of interim camp. We were there for, I don't know quite, actually before that we were taken to a theatre with hundreds of people, and we were there, I don't know how long. There we were taken to Westerbork, and Westerbork I'm not sure how long we were there, but from there we were then shipped off to Belsen.
And do you have any memories of Westerbork?
Not really, except the one overriding memory where I got quite ill. I had really very, very intense earache, and obviously my mother was there. There was a surgeon who diagnosed my problem. I had mastoid infections both sides of my head, with a bit of the skull, the bone behind the ear, that's a bit of the skull. And he operated on me by chopping away the bone, both sides. And my life, I think, was pretty unpleasant. So he cut away the infected bone, and I remember laying on a tire inner tube, because obviously my head's bandaged up, and it lay on an inner tube which was filled with water, so I don't know. But my ear was suspended in the middle,
I see.
So no pressure on my ear. And my overriding memory of that until we were shipped off to Belsen, really.
But I mean, I'm sort of that you had this operation in Westerbork,
Yeah.
in really primitive conditions,
Yeah.
and you without antibiotics. I don't know how you managed to survive the infection in such insanitary conditions.
Yeah, as far as I know, there were no antibiotics.
Well, no, there wouldn't have been.
No, so
Not as such, no.
surgery was the only option, I guess.
And since then, it destroyed the hearing in one ear and severely damaged the hearing in the other ear.
Yes, yes, it's had that since I was, well, whatever age I was, 4 and a bit.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's my overriding memory of
Westerbork,
really.
yeah. Yes. Well, I've been to that camp, and maybe we'll come back to it. We'll see.
Yeah.
We'll see.
Okay.
But so in late 1943, your
Yeah.
mother, your sister, and you went to Bergen-Belsen, but not your father. Do you know anything about why your father didn't go?
Yes, Westerbork, as I say, was a sort of holding camp, I guess. And from time to time, one of the German soldiers would come in with a clipboard and read out names, and those people would kind of vanish. I didn't know what happened to them, but off they went. And on one occasion, my father's name was on the list, and he was called out, and he said goodbye to my mother, my grandmother there, obviously my sister, myself, and he told me to look after my family, and that was the last I saw of him. So that was a very painful time, obviously. And I took him at his word. It was a traditional, I'm four years old. My sister, my mother, my grandmother, obviously 3 women, and I'm the man of the family. So that was quite a, burden, really. But
did you understand what it meant when you were 4 to be man of the family? I mean,
I kind of did. And I thought I did that on a couple of occasions, in my mind, anyhow. So yeah, he was gone. I don't know what my mother got a Red Cross letter after the war sometime saying he'd been killed in Auschwitz sometime before. There was a date there, but it was, as far as I know, it was kind of a date. I can't imagine that everybody who was murdered there, was noted in the book, Baron Blik killed on whatever day. So I think it was a Red Cross, formal thing. So my daughter, when she was about 18, 20 or something, tried to do some research, because as far as I understood it, if you went to Auschwitz and you were a fit, healthy person, which my father would have been, he'd have been about 30 37, 38, something like that. He would have been put to work. He'd have had a number on his arm and he'd have been put to work. But my daughter Cornelia tried to do the research. I didn't know about this until a long time afterwards when she told me. And she said she never found any reference to him at all. So to this day, I don't know what happened to him. I can just assume that somewhere along the line he got killed, or so. That's yeah.
So you and your mum and your sister were put in the Star camp, and I understand that the significance of that is that Jews like your family who were designated as possible candidates for exchange, you didn't have to wear concentration camp uniform, but you kept your own clothes, including the Star of David, and hence the Star camp. And many of the people there were from the Netherlands. And very few were actually used for prisoner exchanges. And there were 4,100 Jews in there, probably at about the time you were there, in the Star camp. But what do you remember of life in Belsen? I mean, do you have any memories of can you visualize it now, the bunk beds or the food as it was, or nice?
Well, yeah, I mean, how long have you got? I mean, we came from Westervoort, which was doable, Westervoort for me, apart from all the surgery, it was it wasn't terrible, so I remember it. But Belsen, we lived, I don't know how many people in a hut, in a wooden hut, 3-tier bunks, wooden bunks with wooden slats, My mother was quite cute because she decided we'd have a top bunk because otherwise you're subject to detritus from people above, So the three of us, my grandmother was there as well, but I still don't know exactly where she was. She certainly wasn't with us. So she might have been in another barrack or camp, or I don't know. Any other three of us, my mother, Clara, my sister, and myself, all shared a top bunk. And so I used to sleep at one end and my mother at the other, and other places, as it were. And that's function. The facilities, as you can imagine, were pretty crude. I mean, there was long, better word, with cold taps all the way along, and you didn't wash there. But as far as I recall, there weren't towels or soap or anything like that. And so every day, sleep if we could, and in the morning, because the place was, pretty unsafe, have a lot of body lice. And the way we got rid of them, and my sister and I had this little game. You get the louse and you put it on your thumbnail, and then you use your other thumbnail and you snap the louse in two, and it would have a little spurt of blood. And Clara and I used to have a game of seeing who could make it a spurt the furthest away. That's our amusement. And then food was served from a cauldron. The food was really a sort of watery soup, for want of a better word, with a few vegetables in it. Because as the soup was ladled out, the vegetables would sink to the bottom. So the further back in the line you were, the more chance you had of getting some of the vegetables. And after a bit, people not fed a lot, so you get more and more hungry, and you want to be at the back to get the vegetables, but you're trying to get your food as soon as you can. So you problem of deciding which way to go. Sometimes I was able to get you come with a little a metal bowl, an enamel bowl, and get this portion of soup. And, you know, in my childish kind of way, I would try and sneak back in the line and get a second helping, and then I'd take it to my mother. And because the other way, that you were issued with a bit of bread every now and again. I can't remember whether it was once a week or what, but you hung on to this bit of bread as long as possible, and it as long as you could, and you had it under your head so that when you're asleep, you know, nobody could pinch the bread, or if you know, you wake up. So other than that, of course, we used to have these hells, as they called them, where they count people. And of course, it was cold. The colder it was, the more times they'd have to count, you know, so you'd stand out there. I was still had this bloody father over my head. The colder it was, the more times they'd have to count you. So, yeah, it was grim. It wasn't, you know, I don't remember making any friends. There must have been other kids there, obviously. It was focused on task, you know, to after my family as best I could.
In your book, you have you talk about an incident where you had a run-in with the notorious camp guard, Irma Grazer, who was supposed to be very beautiful, but yet was a sadist. Can you tell us about that incident?
Yeah, as I said, you get this ration of bread, which you look after for as long as possible. You keep it under your head. So the trick was that people were dying, you know, by that time, and they were ill and they were starved and one thing and another. So people would lay in their bunk with a bit of bread under their head. And if you could tell if somebody was dead or close to being dead, you get the bit of bread. And on one occasion, I mean, I did this, obviously, I did it, my sister did it, other people doing it as well, of course. And even at that age, I was very good at telling how, you know, somebody was going to die within the next hour or two. And so on one occasion, I was sitting by somebody's bunk, waiting for them to die because, you know, I don't know, I think it while they're still alive. Maybe I did, and they were too weak to resist. I've no idea. But anyway, in my head, I thought, once they're dead, I can grab the bit of bread. And I was sitting there, literally on the floor by their bunk, and this woman, as you say, Irma Grazer, one of the camp guards, walked in with her dog on a leash, and she saw me, and she obviously realized what I was up to. She stood there and then took a big apple out of her jacket, out of her pocket, started chewing the apple, eating the apple, and deliberately looking at me, and see the juices running down her mouth. She had that look on her face, you know, I'm torturing you. She knew deliberately what she was doing. She ate this apple. I didn't dare move or run away because she had this bloody great dog for a start, and she also had a gun. Well, if I tried to run, she'd either shoot me or set the dog on me, and it was a huge, great. She ate this apple down to the core, and then she put it on the floor and set her dog to guard it, and gave it, and walked off. So I sat there with it, confronting this dog, if you like, just snarling and doing its job, looking after this apple core. And she'd wandered off somewhere. Eventually she came back. It might have been 5 minutes, 10, I don't know, a little while, and saw that I hadn't run off. I hadn't, the dog hadn't got me. I hadn't tried to grab the apple. We were there exactly as she'd left us. And then she just ground the core into the floor, or the wooden floor, and she just ground it and spread it all over the floorboards. And then thought it was very amusing. Hooked and leashed and laughing away. She just wandered off. So there was nothing for me to scrape up, even as far as the apple was concerned. Yeah, she wasn't. I mean, she was hanged later, as you know, and she had a reputation of being pretty sadistic and so on.
There was a part in the documentary, The Last Survivors, that you spoke about that sort of stayed with me, and you talk about it in the book as well, that your mum was pregnant when you all went off to Belsen, and the time came for her to give birth, and she had a daughter, Millie.
Millie, yeah.
And you spoke about what we might look back on and call your first sculpture. So can you say a little bit about that story?
Yes, as you say, my mother obviously gave birth to my sister, Millie, and this was she was going to be a year old. Really, she just, her birthday was going to be on the 9th of April, and mine was on the 21st. So obviously I was much older. Her older brother and I was going to give her a present, and what I did, I found somewhere, how I got hold of it, I don't know. I found a kind of carrot that had obviously quite withered by then, and I thought I'd make this into a boat and give it to Millie for her first birthday. I got little sticks, stuck them into the carrot, so now we've got a boat with 3. And I kept asking my mother, was your birthday yet? My mother said, no. And the others went on. I kept asking her, won't be long. And eventually, Millie died. To give it to her. Years later, I was having some psychotherapy. The story to Jean, the psychotherapist. Your first sculpture. I guess it was. Out of that came when Millie died. I mean, I was angry, not at the fact that she died, but that I wasn't able to give her this carrot, this present, and I mean, totally irrational, illogical thing to think. But I resented the fact that I couldn't give her the carrot, my present. I'm the big brother. I want to, and I'm sure that stayed with me, life, and like culture for all those years. It was always a tough call, whether what I'd made was going to be valued or accepted, or, I mean, I'm not a psychologist, but you can see the implication of the rejection from my little sister.
Yeah.
Maybe I've kept making sculpture because I'm determined to sort of say, there you are, is good, and
And we will come back to this, because I'm going to ask you some more questions later on about, because there's some parts in the book where you talk about how the psychotherapist had sort of interpreted some of the works that you'd made, and maybe sort of put an interpretation on them that you hadn't been aware of when you made them. But we'll get on to that. Yeah. So you spoke in the book about how you were on the last train leaving Belsen in April 1945. And do you remember anything about your liberation?
Oh yeah. Yeah, well,
Tell us a little bit about that.
I don't know if it was the last, and you know more about the history and chronology than I do, because I've never researched it. Well, okay, I know what I felt. But, yeah, we were put on a train. By now, obviously, Millie was no longer with us. My grandmother wasn't with us. So it was.
Can I just ask, had your grandmother passed away in the camp?
Yes, she died in the camp.
Right,
yes.
okay.
So my sister Clan, my mother and myself, obviously, were put on this train. And this must have been well, I know it was in April 1945, because I had my 6th birthday on the train, of all places. We put on this train, and it meandered through Germany for, I believe, 12 days. And it kept stopping. It was shot up by the Allied groups who didn't know, they maybe German troop train or something. And, you know, if trains were coming over, the guards on the train, you know, would shout for us to get out. And we'd run out the train, and normally it'd be in a field or some place. And my mother would always throw herself on top of my sister and myself. Yeah, they would shoot up the train, and on one occasion, I remember the bullet came so close to my head, I could feel the heat of it. And afterwards, I did manage to dig it up and kept it for the shell of it for years, and I don't know what happened to it. So yeah, this went on for, as I said, about 12 days, and running off the train, and then one air raid was off over. We I was staying, get back on the train, and then chunder on for another while. And on one occasion, I managed to. I was on a. Well, the 3 of us were on a sort of 3rd-class passenger carriage. It had wooden slatted seats, and I used to be able to get underneath the seat and sleep. And on one occasion, I remember waking up hearing this incredible noise, but it was a good noise, it was people cheering and all they were hugging each other and all that. Because I clambered up on the seat, and I could see the little window, these people on horseback, the Russian Cossacks that had come to intercept the train, and they took us off the train, and we walked not very far to this little village called Tovich, told to just go into a house whatever you want. And so went into this house, sister, myself, and my mother, obviously. Saw for the first time in how long it bed with pillows and I had a comfortable, big, comfortable bed. And certainly I remember Cara and I got into this bed, and I don't know how long we slept for. But then at a certain point, I could hear this rough sort of voice and language I didn't understand. And this was next to me. This guy, who's obviously one of the Cossacks, with his rifle still, and yelling pointing. I didn't speak Russian, obviously. Pointing at my sister and gesturing, get her out. And so I thought, so I hung on to her. And the more I hung on, the more angry he got. And my sister's very blonde. She's very blonde, blue-eyed. When I had hair, it was dark and dark-eyed. And so we looked obviously quite different. And the more yelling, the more I'm hanging on to her, saying it's Dutch, my sister, And he got his rifle off his shoulder, and he was going to blow her head. I just hung on to her. I didn't know what else to do. And eventually, I suppose the penny dropped, and he thought, well, the dark haired, and just put his rifle back and off he went. So, yeah, and somebody pointed out to me a long time afterwards, well, there's one promise I've kept.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, definitely. So you spoke in the book about how you then came to England because your mum was English, and so you had English family who you could stay with. And I mean, how was it settling down to kind of normal life, not in a camp anymore, and having food and having a proper bed and things? I mean, that must have been a bit of a shock.
Somewhat, yeah.
Well, go to school as well. I mean,
I did go to school, yes. I learned to speak English. Yeah, my mother, as you say, she was born English, and obviously, for one reason or another, obviously never had any papers, but she managed to persuade one of the officers, I suppose, when we were with the Russians for several months, living with them. And she managed to persuade one of them somehow, because she spoke obviously perfect English, and I believe he had been at school in England or something. It was very hard to get any information from my mother all the years that I tried to find out stuff. I mean, she was, she couldn't talk about it the minute that I opened the door to that. She would well up, and Anyhow, yes, she had a sister and brothers and so on, family over here, because obviously she's English. So we were put on a little plane, little 5-seater little aircraft. Fighting, we flew. I remember flying over the city, seeing St. Paul's with all the bombed out buildings, and a very memorable sight. We flew over London city and then landed at some airport, maybe Ruislip or somewhere just outside London. And my mother's sister, obviously my aunt, and her husband came to pick us up and take us to their house, and they lived in Cheltenham, which is a very genteel place, you probably know. And all the way on the road, we're driving along. My uncle, obviously, for that one, and my mother, because he didn't speak Dutch, and so my mother was saying, obviously in English to him, I didn't know at the time. Had a bit of a hard life, and anyhow, we got to Cheltenham. My aunt Esther and her husband Arch had this very neat suburban semi-detached house in a very neat manicured street. So it was all normal life. It was fastidious. My aunt was cleaned everything until it gone. And so the environment was very odd. And I remember when she used to bring food to us, it was on a plate, and she put it on a table, and my sister and I would pounce on it. So it obviously took a while for us to accept, the food will come, don't worry, sort of thing. Done the best to try and explain that. But my aunt didn't believe what she saw, because by then this would be, I think probably towards the end of 1945, obviously the war was over and everything. The newspapers, I know the British Army had liberated Belsen, and I believe photographs.
Yeah.
And my Aunt Esther just didn't believe it. She said it's all can't be true. And it took my mother a while to persuade her, to convince her, because we'd been living with the Russian troops for several months. So we were quite, looked quite healthy.
Filled out again.
Yeah, absolutely. And anyhow, we lived with them for, I don't know, 6 months maybe. And then my mother got in touch or whatever, anyhow, an old family friend, they got married eventually, and we moved to North London, where by then I was school. I didn't understand a word of what was going on for a good while.
But you sound quite a tough nut as a little kid in school, and not putting up with the school bullies or the school teachers who annoyed you.
Well, yes. I mean, on one occasion, I don't know what the hell I'd done, but there was still corporal punishment, you know. So if you misbehaved, you were sent to the headmaster in this very formal business, and you would be given the cane, you know, that whack you with a bloody bamboo stick. You hold your hand out. So whatever I'd done, I don't know what it was. It couldn't have been anything terrible. Anyhow, I was sent off to the headmaster to have the cane, and I not letting some bully in my mind. Well, it is a bully. So I just took off and I went home. I mean, it wasn't obviously not far, so I walked home. And of course, my mother was there. She said, what's going on? I said, I can't remember exactly the conversation. Basically, I'm home. And shortly afterwards, I think a couple of teachers from the school arrived, and they had a conversation with my mother, obviously, and never said. And I went to school the next day as if nothing had happened. But yeah, I mean, I'd seen a guard in the camp, a woman, one of the female guards, beat this guy with a pistol, but never retaliated. He didn't make a move because he knew damn well if I tried to defend myself, she'd just shoot me. And so she beat him until he was unconscious, bleeding. That was that. And then I don't know if it was the same immigrants, I don't know, but certainly a female guard, and that leaves a sort of impression on you, you know, that so I wasn't going to stand there and let some.
Good for you. Well, there was I mean, I've got so many questions, and I can see the time ticking away. So I want to get onto your art career, but right. I know those watching might want to hear a little bit about the intervening period. So I'll just do a little summary from your book. We sort of fast forward to you choosing your A-levels, and in the book you talked about you wanted to be a doctor, but then you had this realization that it would mean working with dead bodies, and you sort of thought, well, I've seen enough of that in my life, and actually maybe that's not where I want to go.
That's it, exactly. Yes, I had, as I say, this surgery, and then when I came to England, I had more surgery because it was obviously done. I mean, I was alive, which was great. But anyhow, so after this time, I went to a proper hospital, you know, and I remember very distinctly the anaesthetic. My mother's sitting by my bed, and I said to her, you know, my head's bandaged up again. And I said to her, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to be a doctor and cure people. And my mother, you know, that was magic to her, my son, the doctor. You know, by then I was 7 or thereabouts, maybe 8, 7 or 8. And, you know, whatever she said, I couldn't hear, but I could tell by her look face, this was, could not. And that was it. And until I probably was just after I came back, so I was probably just about 6 years old or so. And so for the rest of my school life, that I had no other thought. That was it. And I was quite bright at school. I was always in top stream and this, that, and the other. So there's no question of my ability to, you know, academically to do it. And then the day, as you know, and you have to make your choices for O levels and A levels and so on. And if you're going to do medicine, you do certain subjects, and I had to make that decision on that day, and I went to bed and I just revisited the whole business of, you know, we used to drag dead bodies out of the hut, and you know, as you drag them over the floor, their heads would bounce over the floorboards, and I did that for pretty well every day. You know, myself and my sister would drag people, and people were dying all the time, and well, I've had enough of that. I can't handle. I didn't, you know, I just had this total reaction. I just don't want to see another, not even dead body, but dying body. You know, people laying in their bunks so weak they couldn't even raise their head, and you know, they're going to be dead in a few hours maybe, or so. Yeah, that was a total. I couldn't do it.
Yeah.
And so I came down in the morning and I said to my mother, I can't do this. A huge disappointment, I'm sure. You know, my son, the doctor, is your Jewish mother's, you know. So, and I'd been good at art. I had this lovely art teacher, Olive, and he'd let me paint. I had a girlfriend by then. I still remember she had about 8 names: Astrid, Katinka, Flora, Esther. And I painted a portrait.
Her grandchildren watching alone.
Painted a portrait in the art room, and you know, oils, you see. Anyhow, so I went to see him. I said, I'm not going to go do medicine, I'm going to do art. And he was delighted, you know. And so I trotted off to the Hornsey Art School.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, or the second phase, perhaps, if it actually began
Yeah.
earlier. But in your book, you sort of go forwards till you were, well, a couple of decades later. You made some horse heads.
I did. Yes.
You sort of sculpted some horse heads.
Yeah,
that was kind of, sculpture hadn't really been your thing before that. Do you want to sort of explain how you came to?
Yeah, I was at art school, as I say, and I'd done a sculpture course, but I was never motivated to carry on, and I got married, and my wife then was a potter, and so in a nutshell, I kind of lived vicariously through her work. I was the gopher, you know. I do a lot of the donkey work.
Sort of wanted to hold up pictures of horses with your horse head.
Anyhow, on one occasion there was a guy came to see her, wanted he had a company making saddlery and horse stuff, and he wanted to promote his company by giving a prize to the young rider of the year. And he said, I don't want a cup or a shield, I want a horse head. And so she was drawing things, and she had a pottery where we lived, and I had a bit of a rush of blood to the head, and I went down into pottery and I got some clay, and I made some little heads about that big in 20 minutes or something. And so it'll help them make their mind up what sort of thing they want. And so I brought it up, and he said, well, where did they come from? I said, well, I just made them. I thought might help you. So he said, well, you make the trophy then, you make the horse. I said, no, I don't do that, I'm not the artist. No. Anyhow, he eventually persuaded me to do it. And in a way that I made the trophy, which was about, you know, I don't know, 2 foot high or something, horse head, and in clay, and fired it. And very shortly after that, my marriage at that point was pretty rocky, which was one of the reasons I went to see the psychotherapist. And shortly after that, it all fell apart anyhow, and I moved out of the matrimonial home, as lawyers like to call it, and I rented a room up the road. And the house where I rented, they had a shed, little shed in the garden, and so I made a couple more horse heads, and it started selling them and gathering deals at the time. The furniture shop on Tottenham Court Road had a little art gallery, and somebody from there saw it and said, well, why don't we put some in the gallery? And so it was all started to happen. You know, I was modeling these things in this little shed, taking them into college where they had kilns and firing them, and Hills were having them, and other people here and there bought them. Yeah, it was good, you know.
And I think you said in the book that your psychotherapist had a theory about your horses. She had thoughts about your horses.
That's right. Yeah, as I say, this was the point. Obviously, my marriage was falling apart. I went to see Jean, the psychotherapist, and one time she said, well, what are you doing with yourself? You know, so I said, well, I'm making these things, and I showed her some photographs, and then she came out with this phrase, well, it's the second time in your life that you've been rescued by horses. Talking about, and she said, the Cossacks, you know, they're on horseback, horses, lies, all sorts of, you know, life-affirming things, and now here you are making horse heads. Where'd they come from?
It's a second liberation, maybe from an unhappy marriage or something, but liberation of being out of Belsen.
Yeah, and it made a lot of sense when I mean, it was all totally unconscious, not subconscious, what I was doing.
Yeah.
But living with the Cossacks, I mean, their horse skills were unbelievable. You know, they'd stand on the back of a horse and gallop through the little village, and you know, and of course, the macho characters, which for a little boy who's been asked to look after his family, this is, you know, impressive stuff, you know, in there.
Yeah. But it wasn't only horses that Jean picked up on and had theories about, because you also at one point made some dogs, didn't you? And she thought it was from that incident with the dog in the camp.
That happened quite a bit later. I mean, I was doing these horses, and then I started making figurative pieces and shadow figures and so on. And at one point, quite a bit later on, I was offered a solo show in a gallery in the West End, you know, like prestige thing. And I thought, it's quite frightening. It, you know, you're going, this would be my first show, and I was then 40 years old or whatever. Have a show, and you're on show to the world in this very high-end gallery, and it's quite, you know, you have to take. I thought, if I make that dog, that will lay a few ghosts, perhaps. So I thought, I'm going to do this. I'm going to make a sculpture of this dog that Irma Glaser had. It's huge. This dog's the size of the sculpture's the size of a donkey, really, because that's when I was 4. That's what it felt like, I guess. And so I made the dog, and I made it. I normally always work in clay, and I can manipulate it and model it. This time I built it in plaster directly. In plaster, you know, it sets in 20 minutes, so you can't fiddle about with it. And I wanted that raw, sort of aggressive, in-your-face quality. And yeah, I made this thing, and it's big, and it cast it in bronze. And the gallery, Blaine's gallery, Harry Blaine, loved the thing. It was wonderful. They stood outside the gallery when I had my show there. And clearly that was, for me anyhow, that's the only time I've consciously made something which illustrates an event. Everything else, all the other sculpture I've made, is the connections are subconscious, and one of the reasons why I've written the book, which I wrote just about a year ago, because lots of times people have seen my sculpture and they know a bit about my background and they make their connections. They say, well, what's this piece about? And I don't want to go there, you know. Yeah. If you start churning this stuff up, it gets very painful and difficult. And also, I'm not very good at verbalizing that stuff either. And the book came about really because, was it 3 years ago, this film that you mentioned, Last Survivors, the guy Arthur who filmed it and directed it came to our place, and I've got a lot of sculptures sitting around, obviously, and he made the comment that the heads on my sculptures are self-portraits, but Deborah put him straight and said they're really his father, and she showed Arthur a photograph of my father, which, as you said,
you look very like him.
Very
same majestic nose.
Yeah. And so he made the comment, which I think was very really, that because obviously I'd lost my father and I'd never really had that experience. And he seemed to say maybe these are a way of keeping my father knowing my life.
And that's beautiful.
Yeah.
Your book is full of, in order to, I'm glad that I had this book to read about how you've developed your style and how things in your life have subconsciously worked their way into your art. And I was saying to you earlier how much I appreciated being able to have that insight into not just the inspiration, but your method of working and how that comes about as well. But I was quite interested that in your book, and as you said now, you had your first solo show at 46. And why do you think it was? And I think maybe you've touched on this already, that you really sort of came into your own as a sculptor, not at 21, not in your when you were first at art college, but actually as you entered your maturity.
Yes.
Why do you think that had something to do with your background, that you couldn't quite bring yourself to bare your soul or show that part of yourself? Rejected, as you said about the carrot.
Yeah, I think that's quite a significant. But a lot of sculptors. I know an awful lot of sculptors, obviously, and I was president of the Royal Society of Sculptors for a while, and just generally, I know a lot of sculptors because that's the world I'm in. And a lot of them, as you say, they get to the point when they're in their 20s, maybe, where they're full of confidence about what they're doing. Probably a lot of them have exhibitions and sell work, and I'd never had that feeling, and I do honestly think it goes back to this rejection by Millie of my gift, and I'd never thought what I did was worthwhile, and somehow or another, later on, I suppose, it worth doing. I've never had this great ego that I'm the greatest sculptor in the world, and you're lucky to have one of my pieces. I mean, that's so.
It's not you.
Sort of foreign to me. Yeah, it's not me.
Appreciated now that people appreciate your art, or do you still kind of feel a bit unworthy before a show?
Well, the show is always an anxious time, because, well, you're out there, you've taken all your clothes off, and here I am, so
yeah.
it better be good.
Yeah.
And I've had support. Obviously, Deborah's a fantastic support from her. And she also has a very keen eye, so we'll say that one doesn't work or whatever.
Yes.
So that is great support. The gallery that I work with are supportive. So I'm beginning to believe maybe, you know, and I've had some fairly substantial commissions as well. So I'm beginning to believe it, that, yeah, and frankly, I've been doing it now for a fair amount of time. So I don't know, you know, if there's anything else you know, I really want to prove it, if you like. I'm quite determined in one way or another to get my own way. And maybe this is why, you know, I just keep doing it, because maybe one day it will make sense in my psyche, you know. I think, yeah, okay. And you know, I kind of enjoy it in the sense that I want to prove Millie wrong. Maybe, I don't know. It goes very deep. Just because she rejected my culture, my gift, you know, I'm gonna make sure other people don't. I'm just waffling now, but somewhere.
But that word gift with a double meaning. It's
Yeah.
both a present and a skill, you know, an ability.
Yeah, yeah.
I do have one last question for you, Maurice, which I hope is the cue for those watching. If you have any questions, please type them into the chat and you can ask Maurice too. But have you been back to Belsen? And if so, what was it like?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I did go back once. Take my son-in-law we went first to Holland and hired a car, and I thought, I can't just go straight to Belsen. I have to, you know, stage it a bit.
Yeah.
So we hired a car. He drove, and then it was a shock, because the first thing we saw as we got somewhere close was a big sign on the road, Gedenkstätte Belsen. I thought, I have to say, Julie, that, yeah, of course I was there, but I'd never quite believed what had happened to me. It was always like that was somebody else. This kid was not me. It's very peculiar, psychological. Maybe it's a way of distancing yourself, I don't know, but I'd never quite believed.
And you were so young as well.
Well, yeah, and it just didn't seem that had happened to me. I can't really explain it any more than that. So when I saw this big sign on the road, Gedenkstätte, you know, memorial town, where Belsen, I thought, yeah, it's real. It's really happened. You know, I mean, it's crazy to think like that, but it just hit me. And then we went to the camp, as it was, you know, because it was all burned down apparently. So there's no huts or things there. And it was a very, you know, these mass graves, because when I was there, people were just laying around outside and heaps of corpses, and so now it's all manicured, and these graves with my grandmother's there somewhere, and sisters there somewhere amongst everybody else. And we went there, and obviously I walked around, and ironic, because we'd be driving back, and my son, this was in April sometime, my son, as we drove back from Belsen back to Holland, the people burning the fields. And so my son stopped and asked one of these, burning the winter. which was quite a symbolic thing. You know, we're burning the ghost of winter. Ready.
Was this a strange cultural practice, or were they just burning the chaff of the harvest or something?
Well, I don't know. Yeah, I think they just maybe burning the chaff. I didn't. But that phrase was like, yeah, that's what I'm doing. You know, and
Nice.
people asked me what it felt like, and the only way I could describe it really, you know, was it's like going to my death and my birth at the same time. So I, you know, so I didn't bury it, but I put it away, and which is why I've always said, you know, okay, this is a significant part of my life, but just to be defined by it, I've put it away. You know, now it's spring, I've got a new life. Very poignant phrase this guy told me. You know, they're burning the ghost of winter, ready for the spring. Can't describe it any more than that.
Yeah, I think that's very eloquent. And in the book also, you designed a couple of memorials for Belsen, and although they haven't been realized, they've, you know, you've done the maquettes for them. And
that's right.
And I think do you want to just sort of describe the your favorite of the two sculptures, of that, your artistic response to?
Yeah, I just felt, I mean, obviously having come through all this stuff, I just felt, how do you express that? How do you express the feeling? Maybe the phrase, you know, ready for the spring or whatever. How do I, as a sculptor, how do I make that public? How do I? So I designed what I call the Survivors Monument, which actually depicts a figurative, recognizable figurative form coming out of a sort of morass, out of the mud and you know, all the hideous stuff, and it gradually evolves into a figure. Holds the future as a sort of symbolic egg form, which is, you know, my vision for it, be a gold leaf, because it will never tarnish and it always reflects the light. So you have this progression from the mud, the mire, the horror, into humanity and the future. And that I call the Survivors Monument. And then I've also designed another monument, which is really a Holocaust monument, where trying to depict the enormous amount of people that were murdered. How do you encapsulate that in a monument memorial? I designed that as basically a huge granite box, for want of a better word, which is etched with 6 million tiny little squares, 1 centimeter squares. And when you actually work out how much space that would take, it's huge. So that when you see this thing, and from the top of this, of course, is emerging a figure that's breathing the air, reality. So you've got this huge black box covered in these tiny squares with the figure coming through the middle, through the top. And yeah, 6 million is an impossible number. I worked out once how long it would take you to count to 6 million. You start 1, 2, 3. It's huge. How do you let people down? Anyhow, so yeah, I've designed I made the maquettes for both of them. Yeah, there you are. That's.
And I think sometimes where words fail, sculpture or art can really eloquently express feelings, words that are just hard to find the words for, but you can sculpt them. So in a way, it must be quite wonderful to be a sculptor and to be able to do that and to have that kind of response and to work through all of the, I don't know, the pain, the difficult words that are inexpressible.
Yeah.
To let your hands express it through.
Well, yeah, I hope so, and I hope what I do is you know, does means something to people when they experience it, when they witness it. But yeah, these two memorials in a cat form. You know, after going to Belsen and coming back, I don't mean when I was there as a kid, I mean when I went to visit, for want of a better word, I really wanted to make something to express that feeling of survival, which is why I call it Survivor's Monument.
Well, how do you feel about answering some questions now from those watching? Are you?
Let's see. Let's see.
So my colleague Richard is behind the camera. Richard, what do you have for us?
Actually, we have a quiet audience tonight.
Ah, have I been stealing the words out of their mouths?
You must have asked them all already. So we have no questions so far.
Really?
Right. Well, I mean, Maurice, is there anything that you would like to? Is there anything that you'd like to talk about that I didn't ask you?
Well, only a sort of little, what do you call it?
Anecdote?
Hmm?
Anecdote?
Well, no, not anecdote, but just the feeling that obviously a lot of people like me have gone through the Holocaust and all the rest of it. And I think, I hope I have made a life that is constructive and meaningful, and the reason I don't want to be defined as Holocaust survivor per se, that's it, that's all you are, because you know, life is too valuable for that. And I suppose in a way the message, for want of a better word, is people have all sorts of problems in their lives. You know, they don't have to go through Holocaust to have had bad experiences. No. But I just want to say really that don't let that grind you down. Don't let that be the be all and end all of your life. You know, you have to, it's not going to go away, but you have to live with it. You have to live with it, not because of it. And that's really all I want to say about that. You know, a positive approach rather than harping back to, you know, the difficulties in one's life. So.
And your mother able to sort of, beyond that, live with it?
Well,
or was it always something harder for them? Because I mean, your sister was only 2 years older than you, but yeah. Did they respond in different ways to you?
My mother could never really talk about it. I think when I was growing up, obviously, there's a lot of gaps about what happened here. That as a kid, I didn't remember things, and there's certain things intrigued me that I could never ask her, because at any time, you know, I did try, obviously, a few times, but she would simply well up in tears, and I thought, like, how can I can't do that to my mother. I can't be, oh, well, you have to tell me, because it's no, like, you know. So I never, in the end, after a little while, I just thought there's no point. I mean, this makes her distressed, and she never spoke about it, as far as I know, to myself or my sister. And so her way of coping was just coping, well, maybe that's her way of coping, just essentially ignoring it, while she was still obviously had all that. My sister's an interesting sort of case, for want of a better word. She's heavily into strangely enough, I speak to her. She lives in the States. I speak to her kind of once a week or something, and she was saying that she'd been asked to, curiously enough, after all this time, to talk about some of this stuff, and she said, I just find it so difficult, so hard. I said, but she has huge stage presence. I've seen her in plays and things, and she's one of those people, she walks on stage and you forget everybody else. She's got that, whatever that quality. And she said a very interesting thing. She said, "Oh, I can be other people. That's not a problem." And I thought, yeah, I believe that's her way of coping. She can just act as another person very convincingly.
Interesting.
And yeah, so I can't really answer your question much more than that.
Yeah, well, you have really. I mean, I think that's very, very revealing about Clara.
We have lots of messages of thanks, and also a question, which is why hasn't a Holocaust sculpture been taken on as a project to find funding and a location?
I mean, funnily enough, I was talking to Maurice about this over dinner earlier, that just to see whether Maurice has thought about or would be interested if anyone wanted to commission him to make, the British Holocaust Memorial.
Absolutely, of course, yeah. I hasn't. Well, they've got them in other countries, of course, as you know, I'm sure.
It's going to be the new Holocaust Memorial sort of building.
That's right.
And but in terms of a piece of a work of art.
Yeah. I don't know of anything in this country, and yes, I don't deny I'd be absolutely delighted to make something.
I mean, I think you'd be a very appropriate person, and especially because you're in Belsen and because the British liberated Belsen, this country has that link with
very strong connection.
Yes. Yeah. So if anyone watching, are there any other questions, Richard? Or I feel like I've taken the words out of everyone's mouth. I've nabbed all the best questions.
More. Thanks for the wonderful conversation and interest in sculpture project as well.
So in that case then, Maurice, I'm going to join those watching and to say thank you very much indeed for coming and letting me probe your soul this evening, and for being willing to talk about difficult times, but also to share your life as a sculptor. And I've learned a lot about your work, and I'm very grateful for that. So thank you for coming.
Well, thank you, and thank you for making